constant patch notes, content drops, and newly discovered weapon tech, Destiny 2's PvE damage meta, also known as the most effective tactic available, has been ever-changing over the game's 7-year lifespan, ranging from auto-loading grenade launchers to double-slug shotguns, all the way to current-day raid bosses getting annihilated by Celestial Nighthawk the gun. It really is incredible to see Destiny's rich history of damage metas and just how much the game has truly evolved over time. So today, I'll be taking you through a retrospective look at the best weapons in Destiny history, including iconic exotics, legendaries, insane DPS combinations, and weapon tech that is sadly fading into the forgotten corners of time. I'm Above, and if you enjoyed today's video, a like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Now, let's get into it. First and foremost, this list will only cover the history of Destiny 2. This game has 7 years of meta-defining eras to cover, and for those, I'll be looking at every season or episode as its own era, focusing primarily on the most iconic weapons for that time period. Now, without further ado, let's take a trip back to September 6, 2017, the launch of our beloved Destiny 2. Bungie gave the series a hard reset, nuking our stash of old weapons by quite literally blowing up our vaults during the Red War campaign. They did have a plan though. Rather than making us regrind hundreds of iconic god rolls, they'd go in a more casual friendly direction where weapons would now come with static perks, which seemed okay at first, but really limited replayability and ultimately narrowed player choice to just a few weapons that contained the meta perks you were looking for. So once you got that Better Devils with explosive payload to drop, you'd never need to chase that weapon again. And this wasn't the only drastic change from D1 to D2 either. Instead of having a primary, special, and heavy weapon, Bungie decided to go with a double primary system that moved special weapon archetypes from D1 to the heavy slot in D2, including the likes of shotguns, fusions, and sniper rifles. But there was just one exception to this rule, and it just so happens that it helped shape Destiny 2's first meta. Coldheart, a brand new exotic weapon that was the main focus of Destiny 2's pre-order bonus, was the only special weapon that existed in the game at the time. Trace rifles were a brand new weapon type introduced with the launch of Destiny 2, and though they took up your exotic slot, they did significantly more damage than primary weapons ever could. Coldheart was the go-to boss killer at the time, especially against Callus, as it dealt increased damage the longer you fired it, and was great for getting high skull stacks leading up to the damage phase. And once you beat the Leviathan raid for the first time, you'd unlock the rest of the original god tier loadout, which was Midnight Coup, Coldheart, and Sins of the Past in the heavy slot. Rockets were extremely strong at the time when firing behind auto-loading barricades, and it's also worth noting that Wardcliff Coil, Merciless, and Acarius were top tier options as well. 4 months later, Curse of Osiris would release, giving players a brand new location, all new weapons, and the most rewarding public event in Destiny 2's history.
And there we have it. We have 2 chests for a change, and check out those sweet moves.
Despite receiving a brand new campaign, Osiris's weapon forge, and a Leviathan raid layer, none of it was particularly well received. There were a few solid additions, such as Positive Outlook, Perfect Paradox, and the Jack Queen King, but nothing that really shifted the meta entirely. The most memorable weapons from this DLC were the Prometheus Lens for its infamous laser tag weekend, and Telesto with its historic chain of bugs. This was definitely one of the toughest times to be a Destiny fan, but lucky for us, Warmind was just around the corner. Fast forward 6 months to May of 2018, and Warmind came out with a bang. This expansion did a lot to win players back at a time when the game was really struggling. introducing a new horde mode in Escalation Protocol, some incredible new strikes, and exotic missions that featured some of Destiny's most iconic weapons, including Sleeper Simulant, Worldline Zero, Polaris Lance, and Whisper of the Worm. Pair this with Escalation Protocol's meta-defining weapon arsenal with the Ikelos SMG and OG Ikelos shotgun, and you have one of the best primary and heavy weapons in the game's history. People farmed Escalation Protocol like crazy because the Ikelos shotgun shotgun had a never-before-seen perk known as Trench Barrel that granted the user a 50% damage bonus for 5 seconds after meleeing a target. It also had an insane rate of fire at 240 rounds per minute, which allowed this thing to absolutely annihilate raid bosses like we had never seen before. The only difficult choice to make was whether you'd run Whisper or the Ikello shotgun in your heavy slot, because they were just that good. These weapons were meta all the way through our next major era of Destiny, but with a welcome change that made these two even more powerful. The hype train continued as we approached Forsaken, where early footage teased that this could be the biggest expansion in Destiny history, and it didn't disappoint. Forsaken delivered what many consider to be the best DLC the game has ever seen, introducing 2 new destinations, a high-stakes storyline that tugged at your heartstrings to pull veteran players back in, and the most ambitious raid Bungie had ever released. But it didn't stop there. Forsaken also brought back randomly rolled weapons and eliminated the double primary system that hindered D2's launch. This meant that players no longer had to choose between Whisper of the Worm and the Ikello shotgun in their heavy slot. They could now run both, forming an extremely powerful meta for Day 1 Last Wish and beyond. Speaking of wishes, if you're watching this video, you're probably an absolute gaming warlord like me, stuck in your chair for hours on end, headset dent in full form, wishing you could wash away your gamer filth after long nights of grinding. Well, I've got the perfect solution for you. Geology is a skincare brand celebrating their 6th anniversary, and they were kind enough to sponsor today's video and make this type of high-effort project possible. Geology is different from most brands since they cater their products directly to what your skin needs. These aren't generic one-size-fits-all solutions, these are personalized skincare sets for you and you alone. And it's not just me saying this. They have over 500,000 happy customers and over 10,000 perfect reviews. Researching what's right for your skin can be pretty overwhelming, but Geology streamlines all of this for you. Simply tell them your skin goals in a 60-second quiz, and they'll deliver a personalized solution to your door. It's quick, convenient, and most importantly, it works. Starting right now, you can click my link down below and use code ABOVE70 for 70% off your trial test kit and 50% off any additional add-ons. Thank you again to Geology for sponsoring today's video, and know that a brand like this would never forsake you. Get it? Like the DLC we're talking about? Okay, please buy their products, bye. Though the meta remained consistent from Warmind through Forsaken, the weapon slot changes shaped what many consider to be the all-time goated loadout. Midnight Coup and newly released weapons such as Bygones, Go Figure, and the Duke MK44 in the kinetic slot, the pre-nerf Ikello shotgun in the energy slot, and Whisper of the Worm reigning supreme as the go-to heavy option. Back then, there wasn't nearly as much variety in terms of difficult endgame content, which means that this loadout was used pretty much everywhere. However, Forsaken delivered so many weapons that would become meta in activities like Grandmaster Nightfall's years down the line, including the likes of Wishender and Malfeasance, just to name a few. When Black Armory rolled around, we, surprisingly enough, got a new arsenal of weapons to play with. There were 5 new exotics that dropped that season, and all 5 of them are iconic to the franchise in their own way. Izanagi's Burden dealt burst damage like no other weapon before it, Anarchy was used for passive tick damage and unlocked special weapon DPS options that had never been seen before, Le Monarch became a staple for GMs in future seasons, The Last Word terrorized the Crucible with its ridiculous time to kill, and Jotun had some crazy boss melting bugs, and the Toaster continues to be a fan favorite meme to this day. But the iconic weapons didn't stop there. This DLC also delivered some of the best legendary weapons to date, including the likes of Blast Furnace, Hammerhead, and Kindled Orchid, many of which were reprised with Onslaught due to how much long-term love they have from the community. Destiny's newest raid, Scourge of the Past, dropped Threat Level, which was basically a kinetic version of the Ikello shotgun, and something Forsaken also gave us were pinnacle weapons that you could grind from each core playlist, and Black Armory had the best of the best. Strikes gave us Loaded Question with an all-new new perk known as Reservoir Burst, Breakneck came from Gambit with its famous combination of Onslaught and Rampage, and of course, the Mountaintop, which was easily the most game-changing and grueling to get, coming from the competitive PvP playlist. Mountaintop was the start of a loadout that would finally overtake the Forsaken Goats, with the final piece dropping during Season of the Drifter. Known for its additions of Gambit Prime and the Reckoning, Season of the Drifter was a slight downtick in community sentiment during an otherwise highly popular year. With that said, this season did deliver some insanely powerful weapons yet again, including Spare Rations, Gnawing Hunger, Night Watch, and 21% Delirium, along with yet another pinnacle PvP weapon that would quickly become the most powerful primary weapon in Destiny history. Let me introduce you to the Recluse. Like Mountaintop, the Recluse was a pinnacle reward locked behind the fabled rank in the competitive playlist, and this was a major pain point in the community because it forced PvE players to venture into PvP, especially because these two weapons, when paired together, became the go-to loadout for every activity in the game. And if you weren't playing at the time, I'm honestly not sure I can convince you just how dominant these weapons actually were. Master of Arms, a perk only ever found on the Recluse, gave the user a 50% precision damage buff and a 150% increase to your body shot damage. This buff could be refreshed infinitely by kills with any weapon in your loadout, including Recluse itself. This weapon would melt through enemies like butter and was extremely forgiving to use because of just how high the non-crit multiplier was. This made it insanely potent against shields because shields can't be crit and would melt them regardless of their element. Combine this with ricochet rounds, which doubled its range stat at the time, and pre-nerf Feeding Frenzy, which maxed out your reload stat to 100, and you have the most broken primary weapon in Destiny 2 history. Mountaintop, on the other hand, was great for completely different reasons. While Recluse became a monster after an enemy defeat, Mountaintop's special perk Micro Missile just made it flat out better than any other breech-loaded grenade launcher right out of the gate. This perk maxed out grenade velocity, increasing its damage to ridiculous numbers, and when paired with pre-nerf spike nades, that damage increased even further. This weapon was essentially a special ammo rocket launcher that could one-shot almost every non-boss enemy in the game, and because of Lunafaction boots auto-loading your weapons, it was also a perfect pairing for Anarchy for sustained damage as well. To round off this year of Destiny 2, we head into Season of Opulence, and while this DLC introduced a ton of new weapons, brand new weapon focusing systems, and a complex boss gauntlet that kept the community entertained for months, the loot just couldn't really compare to the previously discussed combo. That's not to say these weapons weren't great in their own right, they just couldn't really shape the meta at the time due to how strong pinnacle weapons were. With that said, the Menagerie and Seasonal Pinnacle quests gave us some pretty outstanding loot, including Austringer, Beloved, Emperor's Courtesy, Hush, Revoker, and Wendigo all in the same season. And while none of them would top the PvE meta right away, many would become relevant in future seasons. But midway through Opulence, there was one weapon that broke that trend. When the first Iron Banner dropped, it came with a heavy grenade launcher known as Swarm of the Raven, and at this time, the debuff provided by Tractor Cannon was different depending on the weapon element you were dealing damage with. It provided a 33% debuff to any non-void damage and a 50% debuff to void weapons, which made Swarm best in slot. This meant that one person could debuff the boss with Tractor, while the rest of your fire team could ammo dump a field prep Swarm of the Raven thanks to Lunafaction boots auto-loading your weapons. This era of infinite damage stacking and auto-reload boss melting was fun while it lasted, but Bungie took notice of these ridiculous damage numbers and brought players back in line with the next major expansion. Now it's time for a sandbox overhaul that would shape Destiny 2's metas for years to come. When Shadowkeep launched in October of 2019, it brought with it 3 new enemy types that would become a staple of endgame content. The champion system introduced barriers, overloads, and unstops with unique mechanics that required anti-champion rounds to stun them. In the modern sandbox, we have tons of different ways to deal with these mechanics via ability subclass verbs, exotics with intrinsic champion stuns, or dealing enough damage to sometimes bypass those mechanics entirely. But when Shadowkeep launched, the artifact was pretty much the only way to deal with them. The only exceptions to this rule were Ariana's Vow, which was the seasonal exotic, and Divinity, which would be discovered through the Garden of Salvation raid as the raid exclusive exotic. Another major shakeup came with a rework to the Lunafaction boots that no longer infinitely auto-loaded your weapons, now maxing out the reload speed of your weapons instead. Because of this, Mountaintop fell off hard for boss damage, but still dominated pretty much everywhere else. This change completely transformed the DPS meta, as weapon perks that had previously enabled ammo dumping were no longer best in slot. Autoloading holster would soon take the main stage thanks to Izanagi's Burden, the new king of damage. For those who aren't familiar, Honed Edge lets you transform 4 sniper bullets into 1 supercharged shot, dealing 6 times the damage of a normal sniper round when you factor in the exotic catalyst. At the time, Honed Edge had no cooldown, and once players figured out that this perk's reload speed could be buffed by the newly changed Lunafaction boots, and that you could cancel the reload animation to spam ×4 shots repeatedly, Destiny's meta was quite literally never the same again. This destroyed raid bosses, let you solo barrier champions before they could even shield, and in future seasons would pair perfectly with auto-loading weapons in the heavy slot, forming the hot swap DPS strategies that are now a staple for endgame activities. This weapon has remained relevant nearly every single season since Shadowkeep, and that's even after the nerf to Honed Edge, which now has an internal cooldown leading to a less spammy playstyle. Izanagi's Burden is the perfect complement to heavy weapons due to how much burst damage it can deal in such a short period of time. And speaking of heavy weapons, Wendigo is a Vanguard Pinnacle grenade launcher that came with auto-loading holster, blinding grenades, and explosive light, a new damage perk that would help form the new meta known as Izzy-Go. This perk allowed the user to stack 6 supercharged GL shots after picking up Orbs of Power, granting a staggering 70% damage bonus. So you'd start with a Honed Edge, hot swap to Wendigo for 3 shots, then swap back to Izzy once Honed Edge was off cooldown, then fire off your second ×4. You then repeat this process over and over and over again for an insane DPS rotation. Another common tactic at the time was much more casual friendly in the Xenophage exotic machine gun. This weapon fired slowly, but chunked enemies with its explosive rounds that dealt respectable damage, especially since you didn't have to pair it with anything else. The only downside was its slow reload speed, but class abilities and exotic armor pieces helped mitigate this issue. Destiny's newest raid exotic, Divinity, made these weapons even better, providing both a ranged 30% debuff and a massive crit bubble, which made Izanagi's Burden so much easier to use. Pair this with the fact that it was by far the most reliable source of overload stun in the game, and you have a weapon that would transform the sandbox for years to come. Multiple fan-favorite weapons would appear during this time, along with an insane community puzzle, but none of this would compete with the strength of Izzy-Go. With that said, there would soon be a shakeup in the energy slot, as Recluse would finally be nerfed after more than a year of total dominance. Bungie would remove the 150% body shot damage from Master of Arms, forcing players to hit crits to gain any benefits from the perk. It was still good, but players were looking for something new to spice up the ad clear slot. Season of the Worthy, a season that was known for relatively mediocre loot, a mind-numbing community event, and the hardest boss in D2 history, introduced an armor mod ecosystem known as Warmind cells that would completely transform the game. These mods would spawn explosive orbs after securing kills with Seraph or Ikelos weapons, and had the power to clear entire rooms of Grandmaster level enemies with a single shot. To get started, all you had to do was equip Global Reach, a 1-point mod that would increase the area of effect and damage of your Warmind cells. You could then pair this with other mods such as Rage of the Warmind and Wrath of Rasputin, which would apply burn effects to your Warmind cells and then spawn more Warmind cells off of those burn effects, which led to a constant loop of destruction. While it wasn't necessarily impactful to the damage meta, it was at the forefront of high-end PvE just about everywhere else. And funnily enough, one of the best exotic weapons to pair with Warmind cells would drop the following season during the highly popular Season of Arrivals. Bungie would introduce Witherhoard, a brand new damage over time exotic in the kinetic slot that would give Anarchy a run for its money. This grenade launcher dealt passive tick damage to any enemy that was either hit by its blight or the blight's pool on the ground, and could even spawn Warmind cells when you had the weapon stowed. This made it great for ad clear and was incredibly strong for passive damage during DPS phases, freeing up your heavy slot to use weapons like rockets, grenade launchers, and the newly introduced Falling Guillotine. This sword was essentially a legendary version of Dark Drinker from Destiny 1, introducing a new sword archetype known as Vortex Frames that dealt extremely high damage. Guillotine could roll with Relentless Strikes and Whirlwind Blade, and when you paired this with the high damage that Vortex Frames were dealing at the time, we had a new king of close-range DPS. It's a good thing Arrivals gave us such important weapons to shake up the meta, because when Beyond Light dropped in November of 2020, almost every weapon we knew would now be unusable, not because of nerfs to their perks or power creep from better options, but due to sunsetting, which is easily the most community-dividing decision Bungie has ever made. I honestly think the community would have been much more receptive to sunsetting if they didn't sunset so many weapons at once, and had enough loot to chase with the new DLC to help replace what we had lost. But unfortunately, of the 500 plus legendary weapons in the game at the time, only 125 of them were now usable with the new DLC, and of those 125, just 30 of them released with Beyond Light. We lost well over 300 weapons and got just 10% of those back in return. More popular weapons would obviously drop later that year, but at the time, sunsetting caused so many players to outright quit, which meant those players would never see them. And of the legendaries we did get, most of them weren't all that memorable. When's the last time you used a Hailing Confusion, for example? The raid weapons were a different story though. Deepstone Crypt dropped one of the best raid arsenals we've ever seen, including the likes of the Heritage, Succession, Commemoration, and Bequest, just to name a few. These came with a brand new perk known as Reconstruction that would passively overflow your magazine to double its normal capacity, a perk that's still best in slot on many weapons to this day. And the exotics that came with Beyond Light were fantastic as well. Lament quickly became the best close-range damage option in the game, surpassing even the likes of Guillotine for burst DPS bosses like Atrax 1. And Cloud Strike, a brand new exotic sniper rifle that came from Empire Hunts, was absolutely god tier on release. Stormbringer, the weapon's exotic perk, was bugged at the time, proccing twice on div bubbles, dealing outrageous damage to bosses until the weapon was eventually fixed a few months later, and even now, it's still a fantastic special weapon. But the weapon sandbox wasn't the only thing that changed. Beyond Light also introduced Stasis, a brand new darkness subclass that gave us crowd control mechanics we had never had at our disposal before. And though I won't be covering these types of changes super in depth in today's video, let me know if you'd like to see one covering ability metas throughout history down in the comments below. Overall, Beyond Light and Season of the Hunt had some drastic sandbox shifts thanks to sunsetting, but that didn't stop players from experimenting with new strategies that would ultimately shape the next meta. Welcome to the era of double slug shotguns, one of the wildest times in Destiny history, where we deleted bosses as if they were the ones getting sunset. After a few buffs, slug shotguns became extremely powerful damage options that ran some sort of auto-loading perk in column 1 and a damage perk like Vorpal in column 2. When paired with Anarchy for passive tick damage, players would hot swap between slug shotguns to offset the slow rate of fire, allowing you to rapid fire what is normally a slower firing archetype. And the best part about Anarchy was the fact that everyone in your fire team could apply 2 mines to a boss without losing any damage whatsoever, an area where Witherhoard fell short. Hot swapping was as simple as hitting your sprint key right as you changed weapons, which would instantly ready the next gun that you wanted to shoot. And when you did this right, you could output some of the highest damage in Destiny history, with double slugging setting all sorts of world record boss kills at the time. Izzy swapping was still king for long range boss fights, but double slug Anarchy eclipsed every other damage method by a staggering margin for short and even medium ranged boss fights, thanks to the extended range from Lunafaction boots. Though it took took a bit of practice to get used to, this damage meta was incredibly powerful and some of the most fun I've ever had in this game. Similar to Shadowkeep, the first 3 seasons of Beyond Light were largely dominated by the same meta that was established early on, but certain standout weapons are definitely worth mentioning here. Season of the Chosen gave us weapons like Cartesian Coordinate, Dead Man's Tale, Royal Entry, and Salvager's Salvo, all of which were extremely strong. This season also gave us Grandmaster Nightfalls, meaning PvE players could now farm adept versions of the Palindrome, Hung Jury, Plug One, and eventually the Azume, introduced during Season of the Splicer. Splicer also gave us Destiny 2's version of the Vault of Glass, along with its powerful arsenal of Fatebringer, Corrective Measure, and of course, Vex Mythoclast, while the seasonal activity introduced weapons such as the Chroma Rush and Ignition Code, giving players a much needed boost to their arsenal throughout the year. And it was around this time that seasonal artifact mods started to get crazy. Splicer introduced Breach and Clear, a mod that essentially gave any grenade launcher a free 30% debuff to bosses for 10 seconds, while simultaneously auto-loading your stowed weapons. Considering how strong Double Slug Anarchy was before this edition, it's easy to imagine how players quickly caught on to such a broken combo. Since Anarchy is a damage over time weapon, it would instantly reapply the 30% debuff and continuously auto-load the slug shotgun you had stowed. This was essentially the swan song for Anarchy, as it would receive several major nerfs to both its boss damage and reserves the following season. But believe it or not, the next season's meta was arguably even stronger. Season of the Lost gave us Particle Deconstruction, an armor mod that granted both fusion and linear fusion rifles 40% increased damage to targets that had previously been damaged by those same weapons. And the crazy part is that this worked on any enemy, not just bosses, meaning Vex Mythoclast would become our go-to primary workhorse. Since Vex is essentially an auto rifle that's classified as a fusion rifle, this mod just made it 40% stronger than any other exotic primary. While it wasn't used for boss damage, things like Sleeper Simulant and 1K Voices very much were. But for players who were lucky enough or sick enough to go get a God-rolled Reed's Regret from Trials of Osiris, it was the creme de la creme for a multitude of reasons. It not only had great damage perks in triple tap and firing line, more importantly, it was stasis, which made it better than any other linear in the game. Why, you ask? At the time, Elemental Wells were another armor mod system designed to augment our weapons and abilities, and since Warmind cells had been nerfed the season prior, Elemental Wells were rising in popularity. But one mod in particular, known as Font of Might, would spawn Elemental Wells that matched your subclass element, and when you picked them up, it would boost the damage to weapons that matched your subclass element by an additional 25%. This was the only buff in the game that stacked with Well of Radiance, and it was the easiest to use with stasis weapons since 3 stasis wells would spawn every time someone cast their super, thanks to a mod by the name of Supreme Wellmaker. And since Well of Radiance was so prominent at the time, all you had to do was have someone cast their Well of Radiance, pick up the 3 stasis elemental wells, then go to town with a 25% damage buff from Font of Might, another 25% buff from Well of Radiance, and a free 40% debuff from Particle Deconstruction. The elemental well system was eventually removed with the launch of Lightfall, but until then, stasis subclasses actually dominated the sandbox due to their high damage output. Fast forward to the end of 2021, and the anticipation was rapidly building for the upcoming Witch Queen expansion. Unfortunately, Bungie would announce a delay that pushed the release back an extra 3 months into February of 2022. But to tide us over, they'd release a mini DLC known as the 30th Anniversary, and with it came a new game mode known as Dares of Eternity, featuring everyone's favorite exotic vendor and the fan favorite Star Horse. We also received Grasp of Avarice, a brand new dungeon that brought back Galahorn, the most famous exotic in the franchise's history, and it would instantly shake up the meta. Unlike Destiny 1, where Galley's Wolfpack rounds would outdamage every other rocket, Destiny 2's version would elevate the damage of other legendary rockets around it by roughly 80%. This would later be nerfed to a flat 27% buff, with the impact damage of Galley also being reduced to fill more of a support role. And despite both of these changes, Galahorn remains as a staple of endgame damage metas to this day. And there were two other notable additions from the 30th anniversary DLC, the first being the introduction of Eager Edge, a perk that was far from best in slot as far as damage is concerned, but would transform movement in Destiny forever. Losing Worldline skating was a sore point for the community, and this was a bit of a make good from Bungie to help bring movement back to Destiny. The second was the addition of the Arbalest catalyst that would fully refill the weapon's magazine when breaking an enemy shield, something that's done constantly with this weapon, making one of the most dominant GM weapons of all time even better. Witch Queen was a massive turning point for the franchise. The campaign received glowing reviews, the new raid had one of the best boss fights of all time, weapon crafting was initially well received, and the sandbox not only overhauled weapon balancing, it also introduced Void 3.0, the first of the 3.0 subclasses that would release throughout the year. Though these certainly impacted the meta, the primary focus of this video will remain on influential weapons at the time, but if you'd like to see a video reflecting back on popular builds, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. The most impactful legendary weapons during the DLC's launch were the Palmyra B and the Funnel Web. Palmyra was top tier due to its ability to benefit from Wolfpack rounds, Font of Might, and Supreme Wellmaker all at the same time, while Funnel Web took over as the best ad clear legendary in the game. People would log into Stadia to farm Throne World chests for hours on end until they finally got their God-rolled Funnel Web to drop. And while it wasn't as powerful as the Recluse, many referred to it as Recluse 2.0 thanks to its synergy with the new Void 3.0 subclasses. It also took full advantage of a brand new artifact mod known as Volatile Flow, which gave Void weapons volatile rounds after picking up Orbs of Power, making it unbelievably powerful on the DLC's release. These two weapons, paired with Izanagi's Burden, formed an updated Day 1 loadout for Vow of the Disciple that would help clear Rolcon contest. Rockets remained the go-to heavy weapons for burst damage, while Cataclysmic, the raid's new linear fusion rifle, would become a staple of endgame content in future seasons. It came with a brand new damage perk known as Bait and Switch that still defines weapon metas to this day. Bait and Switch is a raid exclusive perk that provided a 35% damage buff for 10 seconds after dealing damage with all three of your equipped weapons, helping Cataclysmic rival Rockets even before Linears got buffed. But there was one raid weapon that would completely transform endgame loadouts for years to come. Let me introduce you to Forbearance, the raid-exclusive Waveframe grenade launcher that rolled with Ambitious Assassin and Chain Reaction, a perk that made its predecessor Salvager's Salvo so incredibly popular. There were even statements from Bungie stating that they had made a mistake putting a perk like Chain Reaction on Salvager's Salvo, and then proceeded to put it on Forbearance anyway. Now, what made Forbearance so strong was its ease of use. Instead of having to aim and detonate your GLs like you did with Salvo, you could just shoot the waveframe on the ground and watch groups of enemies explode. The AoE from Chain Reactions on waveframe specifically is unlike anything we had ever seen before due to how much ground waveframes can cover. Pair this with Soul Drinker, the raid's origin trait that would heal you based on the number of enemies hit, and you have the best overall ad clear weapon the game has ever seen, outshining even the likes of the Recluse that had dominated years prior. It also paired perfectly with the newly released Osteostriga, an exotic submachine gun that dealt massive AoE poison damage and could overflow its magazine based on the number of poison kills secured. And since exotic primaries had just received a 40% buff against red bar enemies, this weapon felt incredibly good to use. This year of Destiny would introduce so many notable weapons, including the highly popular Callus mini tool that rolled with an all-new perk known as Incandescent, which was essentially the solar version of Volatile Flow. We also had Storm Chaser, a brand new aggressive burst archetype of linear fusion rifle that dropped from Duality. This was released at a time where linear fusions had just had their damage and reserves buffed, which immediately vaulted Storm Chaser and Cataclysmic to the top of the damage meta. There was even a bug at the time that allowed you to fire Storm Chaser significantly faster than intended, which would absolutely destroy destroy raid bosses with perks like Clown Cartridge and pre-nerf firing line. And last but not least, we had the absolute chaos that came from Retrofit Escapade. This weapon could roll with 4th times the charm and target lock, and when you paired this with Gerfalcon's Halberd, giving this weapon volatile rounds after exiting invisibility, it dealt absolutely disgusting, albeit bugged damage thanks to its high rate of fire chaining volatile explosions over and over and over again. And to many players' disliking, this would later get nerfed or fixed, taking it out of the meta altogether. Lightfall delivered 2 major sandbox changes right out of the gate. The first was a blanket nerf to linear fusion rifles, reducing their damage against bosses by 15%. This would bring rockets right back to the top of the meta once again, with Starfire Warlocks becoming the dominant damage class. Starfire had been gaining popularity ever since Solar 3.0's release, thanks to the most influential aspect, Touch of Flame, buffing all elements of solar grenades. This includes doubling the detonation damage of your fusion grenades that, when paired with Starfire Protocol, Witherhorde, and a demolitionist rocket like Hothead, would turn damage phases into fireworks shows. Starfire would grant you increased grenade regen while dealing weapon damage from a Well of Radiance, and since we had multiple different damage sources ticking from Witherhorde and Wolfpack rounds at the same time, your fusion grenades would regen instantly. This allowed you to cycle high damage fusion grenades that would auto-load your demolitionist rocket every time you threw them, generating by far the highest damage in the game at the time. Lightfall was also a bit of an awkward phase of major armor mod overhauls that simplified build crafting, removing both Warmind cells and elemental wells from the game entirely. And though this made build crafting more accessible to the average player, it also took away several forms of damage stacking and DPS complexities that endgame players enjoyed prior to the expansion. Builds would all boil down to creating orbs of power, then picking up those orbs to deal more damage via armor charges. Starfire would dominate the Root of Nightmares Day 1 raid race, with other notable combos being Izzy Rocket paired with a damage super, the LFG friendly combo of Thunderlord and Divinity, and the newly introduced but incredibly buggy Winterbite. But this weapon wasn't good because of its damage output, but rather spaghetti code that literally deleted bosses from the game. The final major sandbox change was the inevitable nerf to Divinity after its long-lived 3-year reign, reducing its debuff capabilities from 30% all the way down to a minor 15% debuff. This brought more traditional debuff options such as Tether and Tractor Cannon back into the endgame meta. A common support damage strategy at the time was using Tractor Cannon to debuff the boss at 30%, tag it with a Star Eater Scales Gathering Storm for high passive super damage, then spamming a boss with fusion rifles while reprocking Tractor when necessary. This worked especially well on Nezarec, Destiny's newest raid boss that was instantly memed for his minuscule health pool, even getting one-phased by a team during the Day 1 raid race. Fast forward to Season of the Deep, when Bungie would finally nerf Starfire Protocol. This restored much more balance of damage between classes, with rockets taking an even bigger step forward as leaders of DPS. Season of the Deep would give us the reprised Last Wish weapons, including the newly craftable Apex Predator and Supremacy, both of which are best in slot to this day. Apex Predator rolled with Reconstruction and Bait and Switch, making it one of the highest damage rockets in the game at the time, alongside the newly released Cold Comfort from Ghosts of the Deep. And though this is a weapon-specific video, Banner of War would soon rise to the top of the damage charts thanks to the Navigator, the Ghosts of the Deep exotic trace rifle that provides long-lasting grapple points against bosses. Moving on to Season of the Witch, we have some game-changing buffs and new weapons that would completely transform the meta yet again. Hand cannons received a flat 20% buff against red bars and a 75% buff against majors, while Graviton Lance received buffs to its rate of fire and a 67% increase to its base damage. These two weapons flew up the PvE usage charts and are still extremely popular to this day. As for new weapons, first up we have Warden's Law, a strike-specific Forsaken weapon that was originally tied to Warden of Nothing. This weapon was a bit of a meme prior to being sunset, as the dual shot functionality was interesting in concept but just wasn't very good in open play. Bungie would update Warden's Law to an all-new heavy burst archetype that dealt high damage per shot and came with interesting perks such as 4th times the charm and Vorpal weapon. This new archetype paired with 4th times gave us enough ammo and damage to finally take advantage of Lucky Pants in endgame PvE, a hunter exotic that had pretty much been forgotten about since Destiny's launch. It had gained some popularity with Malfeasance in recent months, but Wardens would soon rise to the top of the PvE meta thanks to a recent 20% hand cannon buff. This exotic increased hand cannon damage up to 600% for 5 seconds after rapidly landing precision hits, and the heavy burst archetype was perfect for building these stacks quickly. The best part about this weapon is the fact that it has infinite ammo and is by far the highest primary weapon DPS in Destiny history. It also freed up the heavy slot for some wild DPS combinations with new weapons such as the Cataphract GL3. Players would have to relive past traumas of farming for Reed's Regret because this brand new heavy grenade launcher came from, you guessed it, Trials of Osiris, and would quickly become the most sought after heavy weapon in the game. It rolled with Envious Assassin and Bait and Switch, which allowed it to shoot 20 consecutive shots without reloading, all while having a 35% damage buff that would absolutely devastate bosses. And the best part was that you could pair this with Warden's Law and use both of them in the same damage rotation. But for those who weren't lucky enough to get a god-rolled Cataphract, we would later be blessed with a reprised version of Dragon's Breath during Season of the Wish. This damage over time rocket was great for total damage and was the perfect pairing for Warden's Law due to its auto-loading capabilities. We also received Indebted Kindness that season from the brand new dungeon Warlord's Ruin. Indebted was an all-new weapon archetype known as rocket sidearms that would quickly take PvE by storm. Its combination of high damage per shot, a quality perk pool, and insane ammo economy let you endlessly slay adds like you were using a high damage primary weapon all the time. Though the final shape was delayed, Bungie delivered Into the Light as a stopgap to keep players busy. This was undoubtedly the best free content this game has ever seen, as we received a brand new wave-based horde mode by the name of Onslaught, the highly popular boss gauntlet known as Pantheon, and an arsenal of fan-favorite weapons to chase. Remember Mountaintop, Recluse, Luna's Howl, Midnight Coup, Blast Furnace, and the overly memed Edge Transit? Well, all of these were brought back with brand new perks that incentivize players to grind like never before, all of which were great for their own variety of reasons. Edge Transit gave players who missed out on Cataphract an envious bait-and-switch grenade launcher to chase, Mountaintop gave us new movement tech and high burst damage thanks to recombination, while the others are fantastic ad-clear primaries to this day. Warden's Law, Cataphract, Edge Transit, Dragon's Breath, and Apex Predator would all dominate Pantheon leading up to the final shape, and though players thought this meta would stay consistent through the day 1 raid, Bungie would soon tease a weapon that power crept everything before it. As we finally make our way to the highly anticipated conclusion of the Light and Dark saga, player expectations for the final shape were at an all-time high, and the DLC delivered with a ton of uniquely powerful exotics. First up, we have the Ergosum, an innovative exotic sword in the energy slot that could roll with random perks from other exotic weapons for the very first time, including damage resist from Risk Runner, Wolfpack rounds from Galahorn, and even a caster frame Polaris Lance variation that became the highest DPS sword in the game. But even the Ergosum pales in comparison to a brand new exotic sniper rifle known as Still Hunt that grants the user a golden gun super after hitting 6 precision hits. And to everyone's surprise, this actually worked with Celestial Nighthawk and could be paired with weapon surges, buffs, and debuffs for damage unlike anything we'd ever seen before. This weapon was the catalyst to Day 1 Salvation's edge clears and is solely responsible for solo Witness ever being possible. We had 2 other unique damage exotics drop during this DLC as well, one from the Pale Heart and one being the raid exclusive exotic from Salvation's Edge. Microcosm is the newest ease of use DPS strat, letting you mindlessly blast a laser of death from an all new heavy trace rifle archetype. It's especially strong against subjugators and tormentors, and is genuinely a great addition to the sandbox. Euphony is a monster on Strand Warlock thanks to this weapon's ability to create threadlings on a target while dealing damage, and is easily one of the most unique raid exotics ever made. And last but not least, we have the Call and Aberrant Action, two brand new rocket sidearms that shaped loadouts in their very own way. The Call was the first rocket sidearm in the kinetic slot, while Aberrant Action somehow power crept Indebted Kindness, bringing Heal Clip and Incandescent to the energy slot. And that concludes the entire history of Destiny 2 weapon metas. I had a blast making this retrospective, especially as someone who's been around for every single meta since D2's launch. And to be honest, it was a bit of an emotional journey for me. If you guys have a personal favorite era of Destiny, be sure to let me know down in the comments below, along with whether or not you enjoyed this style of content for future videos. And if you did enjoy it, we'd greatly appreciate a like and drop a sub if you want to see more videos just like this one in the future. Anyways, that's it from me. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.